All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Tuesday, October 12th of 2021. Thank you for tuning into the stream today. I know I said yesterday that we would be doing NBA strategy sessions the rest of the week here. Bit of a change of plans on our end. Really, the main thing is that we want to make sure that we've got projections for you guys and for us to work with here for this upcoming season when we do our NBA content. So just waiting for things with the NBA model to get finalized and get a little bit more information before the start of the season. I think we'll probably start to have at least our initial NBA projections up for this season by around Thursday. So our plan at this time is to kick off our NBA content on Thursday instead of today, just so we can be doing, builds on stream here with the live projections that we're going to be using for this season. So you've got me for office hours here today and tomorrow, most likely. So we'll continue to just keep doing our open Q&A format here for the next couple days. Lots of sports to play right now. We've got MLB playoffs still going on. I know Tuesdays and Wednesdays, no NFL, but obviously right in the middle of NFL season. NHL officially kicks off tonight. NBA right around the corner. We've got a golf tournament coming up on Thursday. No, it's a great time to be playing some esports too, with worlds and things like that going on for leagues. So plenty to talk about, but as always, open to answer as many questions and answer whatever questions you guys have. So I do have one question in my queue here today. So we'll go ahead and jump into that to start. But as always, feel free to pop your questions into YouTube chat or the Office Hours channel on Slack. Any questions you have, happy to talk through some things. So just the one question for me here today. So we'll go ahead and start there. But let's go ahead and get the app pulled up here. Oh, perfect. Okay, cool. So the app is up. It looks like we do have our initial projections here for week 6 too. So kind of fun. We can start looking ahead to the upcoming week. I'm sure there will be some things here that will get tweaked as the week goes on. It looks pretty good so far. I always like to look when the projections first come out for a week at the extreme. Sometimes there's some funny situations where like some guy has is a really great point per dollar play, or there might be a certain player that's like crazy high projected over the rest of the field. But this actually looks pretty good for Tuesday afternoon projections here. So we'll mess around with this. Let me go ahead and get this first question here going. And this was from Riku. And this question says, does it make sense to condense your player pool before building your lineups to get more exposure to the players that you like? For example, having fewer cheap tight ends and QBs. And this is a question that I've gotten a lot before. I've gotten it for different sports. I've gotten it for different positions. I've gotten this for different reasons. Like the generic version of this question, I think really is, should I be curating my player pool before I build lineups? And I think this question makes a lot of sense. I totally understand why this question comes in all the time. In a big part because, a traditional optimizer that is just purely optimizing for average projection is going to just jam in plays that do grade out well point per dollar without much of a care of what those players' actual upside is or how they correlate to other players in a lineup. I think this is pretty sharp too from Riku here, recognizing tight end in particular is where I can see this happen a lot. And again, we don't have any serious outliers here at tight end. Maybe Austin Hooper is kind of that guy this week. But there are certain slates and there's certain, min price tight ends in particular. A guy like that would be an example is a guy like Jordan Akins or something like that, who doesn't actually grade out very well point per dollar. But let's say, for example, that, for whatever reason, it doesn't have to take a very big adjustment to his projection. But if he was 6.85, let's see if that moves him up enough. Yeah, so you can start to see like these low upside tight ends with just a little bit of a point boost can sometimes start to show up at a very high point per dollar. It can happen at other positions too. Running back, again, looks pretty good this week. Like our projections are pretty in line. There's no crazy super value plays, but it does happen at wide receiver. I've noticed too, where you sometimes get those 3K min price wide receivers that are super low salary, a very decent, like middling projection, but it makes them be one of the top values on the entire slate without having a lot of the upside. And the question here is, do I need to, I guess, does it make sense? So the question literally says, does it make sense to condense this player pool before building your lineup? So, I mean, the first answer to that is that this is on SaberSim in particular, you don't feel like you shouldn't feel like you have to do that to get a successful pool of lineups, right? The whole reason being is because we're not actually really building your lineups for the average projection, right? When we're using sim variance at typical setting for your contest. Sliders changed a little bit this week, probably because the slate is a bit smaller with bye weeks and things like that. Default sliders look like they're a bit different. But again, sim variance at high, right? We're going to be pulling random buckets of game simulations to determine the projections for each player when we build every lineup. If you watch this show often, you've heard me say that before. So if you get a low projected player or a good point per dollar, low salary type player in your lineup, it's not just saying that that person grades out point per dollar really well, they fit in the lineup well. What it's actually saying is that in that particular set of game sims that was used to build that lineup, that player had the upside required to make the lineup, right? So if we just start building some lineups here, and again, this is a week where like projections so far, everything seems to be pretty well in line. I'm not seeing any low salary players that are really popping here, but we can go ahead and see what kind of just comes up in a test build. And this is actually what I would recommend you do. Really is your starting point every single week. So without curating your player pool at all, start with your test build and just see what is popping. It is good to know, for example, rather than doing a blanket rule of thumb of Xing out all tight ends under a certain projection or anything like that, it's good to know if there are certain plays that are really showing up in a lot of lineups. I know last week, guys like Ricky Seals-Jones and Ross Dwelly, backup tight ends, low salary guys, not crazy good projections, but had a little bit of upside because of Logan Thomas and Kittle's injuries, right? They were showing up in a lot of lineups. So that's a situation where it's just good to know with what you're working with beforehand. So you can build your full pool of lineups. I'm going to just do 500 here. Could be 1,500, just getting an idea. What does SaberSim like right out of the gate? Seems like we might be a little bit jammed up here. This can happen sometimes early in the week when the projections are pretty fresh, but we've got plenty of lineups. 442 is fine. So let's look at this. And again, I like to expand to the full pool, get an idea of what is starting to pop up here for QBs too, because I know this is about QBs. Question came in for QBs. So always good to look if there's particularly any low projected QBs that maybe are popping here. Davis Mills actually showing up in 4% or so of lineups. Pretty interesting. Again, let's see. Let's look at his value. Probably a guy that grades out well point per dollar. Fairly well, over 3x point per dollar here. And then let's look at tight ends here. So yeah, actually, so Akins is popping. Oh no, that's a little bit low. But yeah, guys under 7 or so points, Jarwin, Akins popping a little bit. Pharaoh Brown showing up in like a couple lineups, right? Some of these low guys in at least our 442, right? So there's like some presence of these players. But where I think it would be important to take a note is if you were seeing a lot of these particular players showing up at the top. It would be worth noting that maybe there's actually a roster construction or a particular low salary player that makes sense at the low salary QBs or tight ends to play. That sometimes happens, right? Sometimes it just makes a lot of sense. But from there, particularly if you're building 150 lineups, if you're building 150 lineups or building for something like the mini-max, right, where you're using these settings where, especially where sim variance starts to get very high at 10, and you're building 150 and maybe your pool's 1,500, you are going to see these low salary guys just leak into certain lineups. You might get those lineups where Pharaoh Brown is your tight end, right? Or Ian Thomas is your tight end. Or I was going to say David Njoku, but he, of course, went off last week. So again, there's a reason that these guys get into the lineups, but I know that sometimes the upside there for those guys seems a little bit limited, and it is perfectly fine to start curating your player pool. There are really two ways to do that. So the first way would be to take an approach that is a little bit more flexible here. And let's actually, for the purposes of this, since I have the time, I'm going to actually run a full build of 150 because I want to show the different ways that I think you can really think about this. So I'm going to build 150 lineups. We're going to have a full pool of 1,500. The first way that I think like the most flexible way of doing this is just doing this in step 3. Again, not being too opinionated in step 1 where you're influencing the inputs of the system of the lineup build, and instead just working with the lineups you have in step 3 and limiting exposure or removing players from your pool that are low salary guys, that are low projected guys that, obviously the builder has a set of sims where that guy has the upside to show up in the lineup, but you just don't want to go with it. You don't want to play that. The easiest way to do this, again, is in step 3. So I'm going to let this whole build run. and we'll talk about this here. You can do some things in step one. I do, while this is building, I will mention, this is actually a pretty big part of my process. This is something that Max has talked about here before on stream, particularly in some of these strategy sessions. We have the minimum filter. So there's a filter on step one that excludes all players below, I think, 3 points for NFL main slates. The reason it is at 3 at the moment is so that you don't over exclude too many defenses. But I think in reality, it probably makes sense for that to be, from my perspective, up even as high as 5. And then I personally will curate even a little bit higher based on that. I will curate my player pool even a little bit higher, sometimes up to like 7 points on DraftKings, where I'm not rostering any position player below 6, 7 points or so for each position. A lot of times what I like to do, and again, I'll show you this here in a second. A lot of times what I like to do is go back to step one and kind of look at what is the lowest projected player at each position that I would want to play, that I would want to have some exposure to. And then I'll let that player essentially be my barometer. Everybody below gets excluded or something like that. And this has the effect, of kind of disrupting the system, right? So that's why I always think it's important to run your test build first so you know what the system wants to do, what SaberSim wants to do, and make sure you're not potentially excluding a player that has upside that you didn't realize that has a low salary. But it also is a riskier approach, right? You're condensing your player pool. By default, you're going to go in with a more condensed pool, even if you're just chopping off the players at the bottom. So it is a little bit riskier, but it can be a strong approach overall. Again, we'll let this build finish up. We may just cut it off here. Oh, we'll let it finish up. We might as well. We've come this far. I see a few other people have joined up into the stream here. Welcome, everybody. If you were tuning in expecting to see our first NBA strategy session of the season, I apologize. We don't have our NBA projections ready just today. So we are going to do office hours here for the next couple days and probably kick off our NBA content on Thursday when we expect to have our initial projections. So I right now am talking about a question that came in here from Riku. It's up on the screen about curating your player pool in NFL. And I'm kind of demoing and walking through the 2 different ways you can think about doing that. So we're going to run a big build of 1,500 lineups, and we don't need the full build to complete. We'll cut it off here. So I'm going to talk about some player pool curation in step 3 versus player pool curation. For some reason, that's kind of hard to say, in step 1. And Cody, I see your question here. As soon as I kind of get through my initial rant here on this question, I'll jump back to your question as well. So again, what my point here was that you can do a lot of this in step 3. And one of the ways that I like to do this is, again, like looking at some of these guys. And it doesn't have to be, the nice thing about doing this in step 3 is you can approach this with some player by player nuance and really kind of think through these things. I mean, right off the bat, Kyle Rudolph is a player that jumps out. Yes, he's projected for 4.24 points. But to me, it's easy to see the path to upside, especially with how many Giants injuries there are right now. So I'm like totally fine. If there's a single bullet lineup, you can go ahead and actually look at what the lineup looks like here. He's also correlated to Darrell Henderson in this lineup. So I kind of like that. Like, I have no problem with this showing up here, especially in a big, this is intended for like something like the mini max. Another player, Mo Alley Cox, right? If you've watched any of the Colts games recently, I watched the game last night and ended up seeing a lot of the game last Sunday too. It's obvious he's involved in the offense. So I actually don't mind like a player like him being in here. Jack Doyle, just for the sake of having an example, maybe let's take the opposite stance on a guy like Doyle and say that we think it's pretty obvious that Mo Alley Cox has been a little bit more involved in the offense there. Maybe this is the guy that we want to remove, right? And we can just uncheck him here and drop him from the lineup, right? We're kind of doing this on a player-by-player basis. And again, the players that I typically look for here, especially at the tight end, are those guys that are like probably between the 4 to 7, 8 points range, and just make sure that I feel like there's an upside situation there for those guys, right? I have actually still been pretty interested in playing guys like, I know I'm getting kind of player by player specific here, and that's not really the point. I want to be a little more process focused, but this is kind of my thinking, right? I'm still a bit bullish on Jarwin. I know Schultz has had a couple good games, but Jarwin I think is still kind of their guy, or a tight end that they still want to get the ball. And I think while people are and projections are so overly focused on Schultz, like I'm interested in a leverage play like somebody like Jarwin. Again, But say I wasn't, right? Say I didn't want any of these plays. There's also nothing wrong with going in here and just removing some of these lower projected point plays from the bottom of the lineup and just tightening up your player pool like this. And we can do the same thing at QB, right? So we're looking through QB. This is interesting, right? Davis Mills is really popping here now in a 1,500 lineup build. And it's a little bit of an uglier slate, maybe our first ugly slate of the year, but also, up against the Colts, who decent defense, play at a little bit of a slower pace. Like, I might just not be on board with this. And maybe I'm just dropping some of these guys off. And again, looking for plays that maybe plays that are a little bit under projected or lower projected. At QB, I think I do this a little bit less. QB is actually probably the position that I'm overall, from a standpoint of player pool, the least interested in like really intentionally curating. I kind of just roll with what I get at QB. But I'll look at running back too. And again, I'll really look at every other position, right? I'm asking myself, like, is there a path to upside, especially on a main slate, 10 games, you only get 2 running backs, maybe 3 if you flex one. There's opportunity cost here. That's another concern, right? I'm like, we really need to be asking ourselves what the lineup looks like here in terms of, can I roster these 2 or these 3 running backs, and could this lineup get there? And Marlon Mack, even though it looks like the Colts have an interest in getting him back involved in the offense, I'm not so sure. Like, these are kind of the plays that I like to think about chopping off on the running back position here. A lot of times, again, I'm looking for guys that are under that 7 or 8 projected point range at running back that I just don't know if I want to get to these guys here. And again, the point is that on step 3, you can do this on a more player-by-player basis. You get the opportunity to look at the specific lineups that the player's showing up in. You could also take the standpoint of cutting exposure if there were plays like this. Like, maybe let's go back to the Davis Mills situation, right? Especially a guy that you're getting actually a fair bit of. Maybe you don't take the approach of cutting him out completely, but maybe you only need a few lineups with him in it, or 8% of lineups with him. To feel like you're getting some leverage over the field on that particular play, right? A lot more flexibility here in step 3. Now, if you are going to approach this from the standpoint of saying, I'm not playing, like, I don't care really who they are. I'm not playing a running back projected under 8 points, right? Or I don't care who they are. I'm not playing a tight end projected for under 7 or things like that. I think I remember Max saying at one point that he has kind of a general rule of thumb that he's cautious of tight ends projected for 7 or less points. If you're going to have that particular stance, I recommend just doing it in step 1. And a lot of times my actual process on a Sunday morning when I'm doing this will be, I will run the test build. I'll start playing around with some of the lineups in step 3 and seeing what things look like when I remove certain players. But ultimately come back to step 1. And for my final build, do some player pool curation here of removing players at the bottom. I think one of my favorite positions to do this for is the running back spot. So, I will go ahead, I'll untick this so I don't see removed players from the pool. And a lot of times I'll start just kind of removing some of these guys that are maybe just low projected. And again, in this particular case, maybe I'm just taking a very blunt tool to just remove some of these. Obviously, these projections are not final, right? I think Darrell Williams is actually probably likely to be one of the higher projected guys on the slate. No CEH this week, right? Yeah, so I think he's actually probably going to be pretty highly projected. But again, let's just assume that these were the final projections. And maybe I'm just curating the player pool like this, just so my pool of lineups that I'm getting in step 3 is more representative of what I want to play anyway. And again, I like to, kind of look for that play that where's that first guy that I'm like, oh, I actually want some exposure to him. One of those guys is maybe AJ Dillon here. Maybe that's my cutoff point. AJ Dillon's pretty involved in the Packers offense. And I'm kind of interested in cutting things off there. And again, I'll go position by position and do some of this here. So a wide receiver, right? Wide receiver, again, very easy for a wide receiver to kind of just make their whole slate in one play. So a lot of times I'll leave a lot more of these guys in the pool. But maybe my cutoff guy is a guy like Deshaun Jackson or something like that. So I'm maybe removing players under Deshaun Jackson here. And you can couple this still with some curation of your player pool in step 3. It can be an iterative approach here where you're going back and forth. I think that's maybe actually the best way to do it is actually for a lot of things here on SaberSim, right? I always mention that is that, a lot of times the best way to do this is to rely on some combination of the various tools that you have at your disposal. You can edit your player pool in step 1, but you don't need to be too overboard because you have the opportunity to do quality control in step 3 anyway. So definitely recommend like a mix of flavors here. So anyway, Cody said, follow up to that question. Let's go ahead and jump over to this now. I tend to favor adjusting exposures after the initial build. In general, how focused will you be on certain players? For example, will you focus on 4 to 5 QBs and various stacks with them? If you hit, great. If not, take your loss and do better research. Yeah, so I mean, I would say my process as well is more heavily focused on editing exposures than it is too much player pool curation or editing projections in step 1. Do a little bit of that, but I do like to mess with exposures here. For QBs in particular, since that's kind of the question here, so QBs is actually probably the position that I'm least interested in picking. Let me think about the way I want to say this. If you look at kind of the in general curve of QB projections, it's pretty flat. QB projections or QB points in general, I think, are some of the most replaceable points overall. And I'm a lot more opinionated about the running back, wide receivers, and tight ends that I want to play on a given slate than I am about the QBs. Part of, again, the value of SaberSim is it allows me to do that, right? I can take strong stances about my wide receivers, for example. I think at least early on in the week, very early here, I think this KC Washington game is going to be just obscenely chalky. I think that's where people are going to go. So maybe I'm deciding already that I'm going to take underweight stances on these guys, right? So maybe that's kind of my approach overall here. The QB pool is automatically going to get adjusted in a way that makes sense. So I'm still getting a ton of Mahomes. Maybe it's Kelsey. It's got to be, Kelsey is popping here, right? So my QB pool is automatically still quite a bit of Mahomes, but it's going to automatically adjust appropriately here to match. I'm just not very interested in QBs overall in terms of where I'm leaving my mark. A lot of times I'll let SaberSim, with defense too, I'll let SaberSim play. Here's the QB and here's the defense you're playing in this lineup. And I'm very opinionated about my running back and wide receiver and tight end exposures. My approach here is pretty much always, again, from the standpoint of doing my research builds, but also studying ownership, updating ownership projections, all these things that we always talk about. I'm determining kind of where I think the big leverage plays on the slate are and adjusting accordingly. Early in the week here, I would not be surprised if my stance on this slate ends up being a bit of a fade of KC Washington based on how I think ownership is going to fall here. My doorbell just rang. Don't know if you guys could hear that, but depending on where ownership starts to fall, right? This is kind of where I might start making my stance. Another thing I like to do here is take advantage of the leverage column and make sure that I'm not obscenely over leveraged to any one player like it actually looks like I am here to Brandon Cooks, right? My highest leverage spot on the entire slate, way higher than any other player here. Don't need that much leverage on a play. Maybe 50% exposure to a guy like Cooks is just fine. Even everything out quite a bit more. That's another thing I'll do here from the standpoint of exposures. But I guess kind of wrapping up my thoughts on this particular question, apart from just thinking about QBs, but this question about really how focused will I be on certain players. A lot of times I'm very focused on certain players so I will look at the plays that I think are likely to be just the very chalky players on the slate, like what I feel like are the pivot players on the slate itself. Last week, it was a lot of times these are like your core cash plays even. It was Madison, Adams, Henry. Those are the guys. Like, to me, I felt like the entire slate kind of really revolved around how you played with Madison, Henry, and Adams. Just for example, on last week, after kind of doing a lot of my research and doing some research builds, I felt like the play, let's go back to week 5 actually here. The play I was least interested in of that group, I actually thought that Madison, even at his projected ownership, was probably going to be under-owned. The play I was least interested in was Henry. So I got less Henry compared to those other guys. And my response, I did 2 things basically. So again, I was focusing on those players. I capped exposure to Henry, I think, at equal to the field. or just under or half under. I can't remember. A lot of times I'll use those kind of metrics where, well, sometimes I'll take a full fade. Sometimes I'll be half under the field, or sometimes I would just cap my exposure to the projected ownership to make sure I'm not overexposed to a play that I think is getting overowned. But another thing I'll like to do is I'll look at the player's correlations and look at the negative correlations that player has to other players in the game. And actually, this popped really hard to me. So basically, my thinking is if my fade or one of my stances in this slate is going to be on Henry, right? I'm going to get off of Henry, or I'm going to be under the field on Henry. I'm counting on a situation where he underperforms his expectation. What player stands to gain when Henry underperforms his expectation? And it's James Robinson, right? Obviously, Jaguars defense, but I don't want to key in too hard on defenses because they're just super variant. They're really hard to predict. James Robinson really popped for me based on this kind of analysis. So I actually then also ended up going in and increasing exposure to James Robinson in the post-build process. That was kind of like the other side of the Henry fade. So it was like cap ownership to Henry. Again, like Henry's the pivot player there in my thinking. So again, I had these different pivot players that I thought the slate kind of revolved around. Henry was kind of my pivot play, where I faded him, and then I played some additional James Robinson, which like kind of worked out. James Robinson actually did pretty well at low ownership, but also Henry obviously had a great game. So anyway, results don't really matter in that particular example. Process is more important. One of the other things I did, and I actually didn't even really do this with intention. This kind of just happened. But obviously, everybody knew Adams was going to be pretty chalky. Probably the highest overall projected receiver on this slate. I ended up with, I'm sure, along with a ton of other people here that used SaberSim to build their lineups, a ton of Burrow. I had a lot of Burrow stacks, and I really liked that approach of getting to Adams while also being a little bit different. So even though I was playing a chalky play, I liked the idea of getting access to Adams via Burrow stacks with runbacks of Adams. Another way to do that, another way to do that would have been to also just pair him with Rodgers. You would have gotten that correlation as well. There's a lot of people out there that are just going to be, especially people using traditional optimizers, are going to be using that optimized just for average projection, are just going to get a ton of Adams one-offs. So I think a way to differentiate those Adams lineups is to stack him with the quarterbacks playing in that game. And that's something that SaberSim just kind of does for you here. Doesn't require a lot of work there. But again, that's just my approach. So I guess kind of wrapping this question up so I can move on, start getting to some of these other questions that have come in. I will adjust exposures in step 3 to make sure that I don't have any just obscene leverage plays that are just jumping off the board that I don't want or intend, right? We saw that with just a minute ago. We saw that with, this is week 5 now. Let's go back to the week 6. Just a minute ago, we saw that with Cooks, right? Like I don't need my most exposed player on the entire slate by 30 points of leverage to be Brandon Cooks, right? I can get 20% of leverage on Cooks and be happy. So I'll do that. I'll pick a few players that I think the slate revolves around, or a game, right? Right now, from like the very initial research builds that I've been doing, I think this is the game that people are going to get to very, very regularly, very easily. Again, just from my initial research. And then I think the other like big pivot plays, the plays that are going to pop this week really hard, are the super cheap running backs. So they're not projected that way just yet, but Darrell Williams, Damian Williams, and Devontae Booker, all backup running backs that are going to be starting this week. Like I'm interested to see where my research takes me on those. Those could be like my 3 pivot players, and I'll adjust exposures to cap certain plays that I think are overowned and increase players that I think stand to gain when those players fail, and so on in step 3. Like those are kind of the main ways that I think about exposure. But again, not the only way to do it. And I know like the strategy, probably this idea of, really keying in on 4 to 5 QBs or 4 to 5 stacks is another alternative that probably would just work fine if you were still approaching it with a strong process. And maybe that makes more sense to you. Maybe it makes more sense to think about these games as the individual teams that are competing in the game and look for some teams that are interesting to you. Maybe especially if this game is kind of gaining a lot of steam, maybe it would be interesting to come at this from the standpoint of like what teams and stacks are going overlooked. Stafford, maybe depending on how ownership falls in this game, either side of this game, really. Are people going to overlook Darnold after he has 1 week down, after he's been pretty much going off every other week so far this season? Anyway, if that works for you, again, just making sure that you're approaching this from a strong research process of thinking through these things. So, all right, cool. Cody did say that helps. Still trying to find that balance between trusting the Sims and implementing my own thoughts. Sometimes I feel like I do too much, sometimes not enough. Yeah, and so if you're concerned about that particular component here, one of the best things I can recommend is doing more of your work in step 3. It's really nice to know that you've got that kind of comfort zone of 1,500 lineups that the builder's basically saying, like, here's the first 1,500 lineups we like the most on this particular slate, and go crazy, right? And your selection process to land on your 150 or 20 or 50 or however many lineups you're playing is really just a matter of picking your favorite of the 1,500 that SaberSim kind of offered to you in the first place. So I really do think, if you're concerned about, am I not trusting the Sims enough, or am I going too far away from what SaberSim wants, play in that kind of playground of lineups in the post-build process, because at the end of the day, no matter what, you're going to pick 150 lineups that the builder was willing to play anyway. The more you start doing in step 1 here, the more you are editing projections, editing ownership, editing team totals, curating a player pool, the more you are starting to alter the system and maybe do something different than SaberSim wanted you to do to begin with. I would never, ever feel like you are not trusting the Sims if you are playing lineups from your pool of 1,500 without adjusting anything, right? If you're playing in this system here. So, all right. I see a few other questions that have come in here. I'm going to hit these in roughly the order that they came in. So this was a question from Nikhil, I think, and this came in the Slack. And this question says, should we be getting some sort of minimum exposure to each game on the slate? For instance, last week I had very low exposure to the LIC Cleveland game and obviously got burned due to it being a shootout. I don't think it is... I don't think it's very reasonable to assume that you can get solid exposure to every game on the slate. So this question, there's kind of two competing ideas here almost in this question, right? The first part is, should we be getting minimum exposure to each game on the slate? You can do that, but you cannot do that and also get significant exposure to every game on the slate. Right. The second part of this thing is I had very low exposure to the Chargers Cleveland game and obviously got burned due to it being a shootout. You can get lucky, right? Here, let's just say again that we've got a crystal ball, and it's going to be the Browns game again, but this time it's the Kyler Murray side of that, right? We have 2 lineups here in our 150, and we could get totally lucky here and have the nuts in one of these lineups, but we don't have a ton of exposure to this game, right? So again, it's kind of the balance of risk versus upside here, where I don't think you can necessarily you can't really do both of these things. You can't have a very widespread exposure to a bunch of different games and cover all your bases and account for the situation where any game on the slate shoots out, and also give yourself a maximum amount of upside to those games in the event that they shoot out. So it's kind of 2 competing ideas, and I think it depends a lot on what your particular risk tolerance is. It also depends on the variance of the game. So for NFL, again, the biggest control over how exposed you are to any one player, just by default, is the sim variance slider. The same slider that determines how much upside, right? How much upside we need to shoot for in our lineups also ultimately ends up showing how exposed you are to certain players and how many players are in your pool. And this slider is back tested by building tens of thousands of lineups at every setting and comparing them to past contests that have run. So, I mean, in many ways, the builder is telling you that, based on the natural variance of the game of football, what we need from a lineup to be competitive in this particular contest, it makes sense to have exposure to 14 different QBs. There's only 20 different QBs playing football on Sunday or in the main slate, right? We are getting exposure to 70% of the QBs that are even in the pool here already. And again, we are fairly spread out with our most exposed QB at the moment only showing up in 23% of the lineups. This is already pretty spread by default. So you could consolidate here, right? And one of the ways I've shown people how to do that in the past is to start at your lowest exposure players. So if you said, I'm not playing 14 QBs, I would rather focus on a few teams, maybe something like Cody was saying, I'd rather focus on a few teams and give myself the greatest chance of building that high upside lineup when I'm right. You could start removing some of these players at the bottom that aren't showing up in a lot of lineups for you anyway, and consolidate your pool a bit here. You can uncheck them, or you can just set max exposure to 0. Both of these things work the same way, right? And I'm kind of having the effect of consolidating my lineups down. And the builder may fight you a little bit on this, again, because there's a lot of diversity in the pool of QBs. But again, all we're doing here is just removing our QBs at the bottom and trying to consolidate to a maybe a smaller group of QBs that we want to go into the slate with. Maybe it's 5 guys, right? Maybe we want 5 QBs. We're going to play 5 different stacks, and those are our teams, right? So in this particular case, you're going to be way riskier, but you are going to have way more upside. And you have a lot of leverage on some low-owned plays, right? Like maybe it's Jared Goff that is the Justin Herbert of last week, right? Probably not the same caliber player overall, but any given Sunday, the difference between having 19 different lineups, 13% of your total exposure to a 2% owned QB versus what you get by default here, which is less, 9%, it's giving you more shots on goal when you get it right. But if you go through the process of adjusting that exposure and it ends up being some guy that you have none of, you're just sunk. You don't have any of them. So it's ultimately your kind of decision. I would say if you're unsure of what your risk versus upside portfolio looks like, what your risk assessment looks like for a slate, I would say trust the default sliders, right? Because the sim variance slider that has been back tested to its position at 10 for large field NFL GPPs is the slider that is ultimately controlling how many players are in your pool, how much exposure you're getting to those players. And by default, it's going to indicate to you that it in general makes sense to be pretty spread out. And I think, from doing a little bit of investigation into like what some of the pros do and some of the top NFL DFS players do, I think you'll find that this is very similar to what the portfolio of players that a pro might use for 150 lineups is, right? Because it's the game's pretty variant. So anyway, but really good question there. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead, look at this next question. This came in from Aaron. Hope all is well. For NBA, which 2 to 3 positions do you start building your lineups? Cool. Let's look at this. So again, don't have NBA projections yet for this season. So we'll go ahead and just pull up some random slate from last year while we are getting ready here. I don't really like to think about things this way, to be completely honest. A lot of times I just don't come at it from this standpoint of saying I'm going to start, especially for every single slate, like I'm going to look at my centers first or my guards or, any other way that you could approach this, right? I think it depends. There's a lot of slate to slate nuance based on salaries and matchups and the contest you're playing. I think the best way, what I like to do when I'm looking at NBA, similar to how I do other sports, is I will start things off with a test build and just get familiar with what the builder wants to do. So again, default settings for a contest about the size that I might be playing. Maybe it's something like this. And I'll just build and I'll just look at what the lineups look like. So again, this is for January 25th of this year. I don't even know what was going on this particular slate, but I'll build a set of lineups and just get familiar with what are like the plays, like who's everybody going to play? What do the common lineups look like? And you can do this for 1,500 lineups. You can do this a lot of different ways, but this is how I'll get familiar with the slate. So let's just see. I'm curious now, like what's popping up. Okay, so probably a night that Joel Embiid was sitting, right? Dwight Howard is popping. Best value play on the slate. Obvious that this makes a lot of sense here. Like typically, just from a positional standpoint, you will see this that if the value is at the bigs, if Dwight Howard's the best value play on the entire slate, then the pay up options pretty much immediately become the guards. It also looks like Najee Marshall. Maybe this was a night that Zion or somebody on the Pelicans was sitting out, so we had value here on the Pelicans too, and OKC, right? All these value guys are all these bigs, so the guards start to be the plays that pop as the pay-up options, right? So again, even if I was just playing a few lineups, right? This question to me kind of sounds like it's almost coming from the standpoint of like a hand building point of view, which is definitely not how I do my lineups. SaberSim builds 100% of the lineups that I play. But let's say one of the things I do sometimes, if I'm just playing a few lineups on a slate, I will hand pick my lineups rather than hand build them. So, this would be kind of where like I would be starting from one way or another. Right? Whether I was deciding that I wanted to go with this particular construction or get different, right? Or if I wanted to mix that in a little bit, like what I could do. One thing I really like to do here is to just remove all these lineups. And let's say I was going through the process of kind of hand picking a few different lineups into my pool, right? I would be kind of keying in and knowing that I think the easiest construction that people are going to get to is playing value bigs and expensive guards. And, maybe I'm getting some exposure to that, right? But maybe I'm also looking for, I'd be curious if there are any other kind of different constructions that are showing up here where we do something a little bit different. But again, it's kind of weird because this is just some random Monday slate from last season. But this is sometimes the way that I like to kind of approach things for NBA. And it doesn't have to be dramatically different, but a lineup like this is kind of interesting where you pay up at a forward spot that I think is going to be occupied by a value play a lot. This one's kind of interesting a little bit too. Paying up at center. Yeah. And Harden for Luka, like direct pivot or something like that, right? I've kind of filled out 5 lineups. Again, I did this really fast, and this isn't maybe representative of exactly what the process would look like, but I ran the test build. I figured out what the popular construction was here. Cheap bigs, expensive guards, right? Picked a few lineups that I wanted to play out and found a few ways to get different with my constructions here, just based on what SaberSim was giving me as viable lineups. But again, this is only because this particular slate, it fell this way. Right, that the value opened up this way, and these are the common constructions. Definitely wouldn't say every single slate start with your guards, or start with your forwards, or start with your centers. Right, it changes. So I would say start with a test build, figure out what are kind of the cornerstone plays, what are the cornerstone constructions of a slate that are very easy for people to make, and then adjust from there. So cool. Awesome. Okay, so there was a question here. This came in from CP Hustler, and he said, since you're not ready to talk NBA yet, how about we talk about some NHL strategy? Seems to be several people that are interested in that. Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I'm down to talk a little NBA strategy. I just, for our kind of, strategy session stream where we're, really kind of kicking off the season with some of our like longer type videos and things. I just wanted to make sure I had new projections, so I wasn't diving into some random old slate to walk through some of this stuff. But if you've got specific NBA strategy questions for me over the next couple of days, I'm more than happy to answer those. For NHL, full disclosure, I have never played too much NHL. I am hoping to dive into it more heavily this year. But it will be a little bit of a new experience for me. I would say, there's a few things that are really nice about SaberSim, even when you're just diving into a new sport and you're not super familiar with, because there's so much data here powering everything. You can learn about the optimal way to play a sport very quickly, just by kind of poking around in the app. So again, one of the things that jumped out to me here, obviously this is a small slate for tonight. But even just poking around in some of the slates from last year, actually, do we have the 5-game slate yet up? Actually, no, let's just go back to like some of the slates from last year, right? You can look at, let's see, this will work. 5-gamer. That's fine. I don't know why it loaded January 13th when I selected this date, but you can look at player ranges of outcomes or default sliders and start to get an idea of what it takes to be successful in that particular sport. One thing that immediately jumped off the page to me was how similar the sliders looked to something like baseball. They're like very, very similar. Actually here, little bit lower. So a little bit lower correlation, a little bit higher sim variance, and a similar ownership, right? Obviously, a sport where this is immediately just jumping off the map and saying chalk is unreliable, highly variant sport, and a sport where correlation matters. You can also start looking at ranges of outcomes of different players. So you click on a player and look, and what I'm seeing here is obviously not a very normal distribution. And in particular, yeah, so we can see it looks a little bit like a baseball hitter, actually. Most common outcome is 0. Big tail of high ceiling games, right? A lot of outcomes in the simulations that are under that player's mean, which would be right about here, right? The majority of outcomes are under this, right? So, you hear often hockey DFS plays similar to baseball DFS, but you can actually validate that and define why that is by digging into the simulation data and the default sliders, which are also like data driven and back tested to kind of figure out why, and then be prepared to build competitive lineups right out of the gate, even for a sport that you're not necessarily super familiar with. Goalies in particular have a little bit more of this normal distribution, right? Could potentially be a little bit more of a reliable player to play around their mean, their most common outcome. But overall, hockey strategy, we are hoping to do a strategy session and maybe even reach out to a few people in the community that are skilled hockey DFS players and get people on to talk about hockey a little bit more in depth. I will be really kind of diving in more heavily to this sport this season. So I'm pretty excited about that. I've dabbled a little bit in the past, but never really spent a bunch of time on it. So, for this particular question, I think one of the coolest things about SaberSim, again, to wrap up here and to summarize, is that you can explore our simulation data and explore our slider settings and explore ranges of outcomes and correlations. That was one other one I wanted to mention between players, and learn a lot very, very quickly about what the optimal strategy for a sport is, and get yourself up to speed building, at least kind of semi-competitive lineups or actually, more than that, probably legitimately viable lineups for a sport very quickly, even without a lot of knowledge of the sport specifically. So with all that said, hockey content coming, sponsored by and including people that know hockey DFS a little bit better than I do at the moment. So. Cool. Okay. So Luke Diesel said, best way to use SaberSim for cash games. So I will first of all point out a couple video resources for you. I think NFL in particular, I'm not sure what sport, if there is a sport in particular that this question was aimed at. NFL is one of the best, if not the best sport to play for cash games, I think. There are enormous contests for NFL, and there are a ton of soft players that don't know how to build cash game lineups. We did a strategy session on our YouTube channel. If you scroll down a bit under strategy sessions, finding an edge in NFL DFS cash games. Max and I talked about this here. 48-minute long video, went kind of totally in depth to NFL cash game strategy and how to build winning cash game lineups in NFL. So definitely recommend checking that out. We are planning on doing a similar video for NBA. If I had to come up with the second best sport to play in cash games, it would probably be NBA. One, because the contests in NBA are also pretty large. But two, it is a very low variance sport, or it is a lower variance sport, which means that it is the best plays are a little bit more likely to hit their projection. Players are normally distributed. A player's most common outcomes are consolidated around their mean. It's just a bit easier to build successful NBA cash lineups. So NBA, I think, can be another strong sport to explore. And on that subject, one of our opening week NBA strategy sessions here is going to be on cash games. So look forward to playing that. From there, I will say, while I have a bit of time to talk about it here, the spark notes of any cash games conversation is really that I would say your cash game strategy is 90% contest selection and probably 10% roster construction. The biggest, most important thing you can do in cash games is to find weak opponents and really, take advantage of those players' inability to set a successful cash game lineup. Most of cash game roster construction strategy is packing in the best point per dollar plays you can under the salary cap. So if you look at our cash game build, what it will typically be is if you set style to cash, your sliders are just all going to go off, and we are going to optimize here for average projection, right? No correlation, no ownership fade, no sim variance, totally average projection, and build you the best possible lineup we can under the salary cap. And the goal is basically trying to find players that do so, or you are using worse projections or are less capable of finding these optimal lineups via contest selection. So the principles of contest selection that we talk about in other videos, playing contests with high effective entrants, spreading out your risk in cash games, that mostly comes in the form of playing head-to-heads and playing as many lower dollar single entry double ups and 50-50s as possible before going up in stakes, playing under $3 if you can to play against softer opponents, right? These are all huge components in your overall cash game strategy. Ryan said play Yahoo cash. Yeah, that can be another good idea too. Yahoo has rake-free head-to-heads. At least you can play one rake-free head-to-head at every dollar amount value on Yahoo, which, you take the 10% rake out of your cash games and they become much better contests as well. So seeking out other sites where you can get better deals on your cash game action is also a really strong approach. But from the standpoint, there's a few things from the roster construction standpoint that we go into pretty deep in this cash games video about, when you are, well, I guess there's a few things there. One is avoiding risk and avoiding downside by being cautious of players with injury designations. Another one is when you are torn between multiple lineups, looking at ownership and maximizing ownership as a way to break ties. Those, I think, are things that people often get very excited about when thinking about cash game strategy. But the edge there is actually much smaller compared to just using proper contest selection principles, playing a top optimal, a lineup that is projected to score the most points. And so we could actually sort by projected score and rolling with it. If you are interested in, learning more about how to use SaberSim for cash games for NFL, I really do highly recommend watching this video because it does go into more detail than I can do here, and staying tuned for our NBA cash games video, which should be out in the next week. There are some strategies there. There's some nuance here in your roster construction or your roster selection, I think maybe is a better way to say it. But most of the value you're going to add is really spending a lot of time in your contest selection and finding weak opponents. So. All right, cool. I think those are the only questions I've got here in my queue. Does anybody else have any other questions for me here today? Been an awesome show so far. We've talked a lot about curating and consolidating a player pool, either in step 3 or in step 1. Talked a little bit, at least introduced a little bit NBA strategy. Talked about how to, start putting together lineups and running test builds for NBA. Talked a little bit of cash games here just at the end. What else do you guys have for me here? Seems all quiet here. I think we will go ahead and call it a day for this show. Thank you again for everybody that tuned in, and thank you for everybody that watches and listens to these shows as the recording on YouTube here after the fact. We will be right back again tomorrow with another office hours at 2 p.m. Eastern. So if you have questions as you're building your NHL lineups for tonight, again, not an NHL expert at the moment, but always happy to talk about it. But also any MLB lineups or looking ahead to football this weekend, always happy to talk about those questions on tomorrow's show. Thursday should be our opening day of NBA content once we have our initial projections up for the slate next Tuesday. So looking forward to that as well. Have a good rest of your day, guys. Thanks for tuning in again, and take care. See ya.